it is with a heavy heart that I welcome everyone, including myself and my fellow guests, to the
I'm a guest now?
and co-hosts. Sorry. Let's my
Off the
fellow
top of the dome. Off the top of the dome.
cohorts
Off the top
and
of the dome.
oh, this is staying in.
Of course.
This
Oh,
is
absolutely.
this is the episode where we just can freely not care. This is episode 25 of Homer Bound. This is the wrap party episode, as it were. Hopefully by now you've trekked through all 24-ish episodes, depending on how you like to listen to things, of our discussion of Homer and the works associated with him, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I, as usual and as always, am, will be, and continue to be, and would rather be Wrist and Llama.
I am Llama.
Hello.
I am simply Llama. You all can
Presently.
figure it out.
And of course, we have with us our illustrious, magnanimous, and
Esteemed.
otherwise radiant Dr. Daniel.
Thank you
How are
once
you
again
doing?
for joining the chaos.
Make me sound so good. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm glad to be back.
You know, one thing that I have absolutely taken away from talking about the Iliad and even and the Odyssey and just this stuff in general is I've come to realize how much I love some of the writing elements. I love the epithets. I wish we did more of that in modern day writing. I don't know if we have those though. I'm trying to think of anything that I've run into that like just sort of unashamedly like assigns those things to. I know that in the original Greek it's for part of it's for metrical reasons to like extend or squash or change the way the lines go, but I just wish we could have like some of that.
I can
and
start
just have it be
calling you
there.
Wrist the childish and degenerate.
See, that's not the epithet that I would pick for myself.
Well, does anyone really pick their own epithets, or is it like attributed to them
No.
by outside forces? So,
You're right.
and also, I mean,
You're right.
if you think outside of the box in terms of like epithets being like adjectives or qualities that are being associated with certain people, I mean, if you think outside the ambit of literature, I mean, it happens all the time in the modern day. Politics, in social circles, cultural things like that. So yeah, I think that you're right that there's like some element of that, a vestige of that in Homer, but we still tend to assign nicknames, assign some qualities to people in
Or
the
just
modern day.
qualities to people.
Qualities,
I mean,
yeah.
I feel like how many times have you called a friend like, oh, she's, kind of spacey, or she's really, like really punctual.
Right.
Whatever. I don't know. I'm just thinking of things off the top of my head that aren't some of the ruder things that I might call
Yeah.
some people.
No, I have a few of those too. That
But I
I'm
wouldn't say like punctual llama went to the store to get
Right.
I wouldn't say that, but I like that. I really, really like that. Maybe too much. But yeah, it's, as I said, it's with a heavy heart that I've brought us all together for this last episode.
I think I'm a little less heavy-hearted about it.
Oh well,
I'm
good for you. I'm glad that
bittersweet. It's bittersweet.
I'm glad the separation is easier for you than it is for me.
I just don't want it to be
It's
sad.
bittersweet, though.
I'm not sad.
No, I'm not sad. Sorry, I'm not weeping warm tears like Agamemnon or Patroclus. I am, but as I said before I sat down, we've been doing this a couple times a week for 3 months. This has been a part of
Yeah.
my life.
It's gonna be weird.
I for one, I was struggling to figure out how I was going to say this, because what the first thing that I wanted to say was this went way better than expected, which of course has the inverse connotations of
I thought it was going to
I
tank.
expected,
Yeah.
or implication. I thought this was going to
Yes.
suck, which isn't true, but I wasn't sure what to expect, and so in a way, I'm not totally sure how to evaluate like the listener experience, because I've been here, I've talked about it. I can't really give that to myself, but from a discussion experience, like I've been listening back to the audio, for instance, of I've looked through episode 1. I just listened through the whole thing, and I was able to identify like how my understanding of the Iliad and that sort of space grew over the course of this. So like episode 1, me didn't know the things that I know now, and so I can talk about those things a little bit better now. And so seeing that happen, that made me very happy. Just having that feeling of knowing that I've come a little bit further than I started.
Yeah, I think we've both learned a lot. I know I for sure have learned a ton, and just like I think broadened what I thought of the classics, because I'm not a classicist. I'm not a person who previous to this was like particularly interested in the classics.
You didn't read the Percy Jackson series 3 times over?
That is
Come
not
on.
the classics.
Classics related, but not
It's
exactly.
classics adjacent.
Yes.
Hey, listen, I'm not going to call anyone out because I don't know these names, but I've run into like video reviews where someone's like, oh, I'm like a huge Greek mythology nerd. I've read all the Percy Jackson books. I'm like, can you lead with something a little bit? I mean, I'm sure the Percy Jackson books are great. Like, no hate to the Percy Jackson books. They got a lot of people interested, but there must be something at least a little better than. Again, not shitting on it or anything, but it's just like
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it certainly wasn't like a niche interest of mine, or anything like
Yeah.
that. I've always had that kind of lingering association with Greek mythology because, like, it's cool. I read about it as a kid. It was cool. And I continued to think that it was cool, but never really delved into it. And so this is, I think, broadened my image or my thinking on that to just think of it as, like, honestly another really cool thing to read, as opposed to I think the image that a lot of people get of like a very stuffy and tweed jacketed kind of subject that is like inaccessible for the everyday layman. I think this has changed my perspective on that in a huge way, because I enjoyed this, and especially in terms of the Iliad. Like the Odyssey, I knew that I would have fun getting back into. I enjoyed the Iliad way more than I thought I would. And it was really fun. And I think, having the conversations with you helps a lot with that. Having the conversations with you, Dr. Dan, helped me a lot with that. And just kind of, and especially, also with, Kira Jones, Joel Christensen, some of the guests that we had on have just been fantastic in just like making me see things in a completely different way and making it feel a lot more like fun reading as opposed to like an academic exercise, even though we have been kind of having fairly academic conversations about it to an extent,
Enough.
I think probably more serious than the average person gets into.
I mean, how would you define academic in that context then?
Just, I mean, like actually focusing on elements of the storytelling, actively focusing on the meanings behind it, and like actually, like, I think the average person is not going to wonder what this sounds like in the ancient Greek,
Right, yeah.
which we've done like many times.
Yeah.
Trying as much as we could not to like explicitly invoke your name,
And suddenly I appear.
but still wondering, like, is this just a translation thing? Is this a original Greek thing? Or is this something that is kind of in the original Greek but then is amplified by the translation? Or is it a mixture of, one or more of those things? Like, I don't think that those are questions that like the average person is thinking of when they're like, oh, are Achilles and Patroclus banging?
Right.
Like,
Yeah. I'm curious, Dr. Daniel, this mindset that Lamas described, seeing the Iliad and the Odyssey and just classics in general in that sort of, as she said, like stuffy tweed jacket kind of way. Is that something that you encounter in your classroom? Is that something you have to deal with, or do you just kind of let it lie and like this is kind of the environment?
100%. I think that exactly as Lama says, there's sort of like this perception from the outside that when you call something classics, right, it's classics because it's classical. You put it up on a pedestal and it's supposed to be like revered in like this stuffy museum or something like that. And it's something almost inaccessible unless you're like in college or like in a or going to grad school or something like that, right? This is a perception that I've been trying to like blast apart in my classrooms because when it comes to things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's storytelling about relationships. We're talking about friends. We're talking about enemies. We're talking about family. We're talking about love. We're talking about hate. Like these are all emotions. These are all things that were just as powerful back in 1200 BC as they are now in the modern day, right? And one of my biggest goals as a teacher is to get my students to understand and to realize that even though we're talking about Achilles and Patroclus or Odysseus and Penelope, the things that they're going through have some real implications for their daily lives in the modern day, right? In terms of the way that they relate to other people, the way that they see themselves in society, the way that they're supposed to comport themselves when they're shipwrecked with the witch. I don't know, like all these different things that could happen to
That happens
this,
to me so
like you
often.
do.
on a daily basis,
you.
right? But yeah, no, that it's definitely a perception that that I still encounter in my classrooms. One particular memory comes to mind. It was like I think that
I was gonna say, how do you handle this? How do you
well,
handle it?
so the second year that I was teaching, I taught a class on like an intro to Roman literature and society or something like that. And as a first exercise for the class, I put my students into groups, and there were like 30 students in the class, groups of like 5, and I asked them to brainstorm word associations that they have when I say the word Rome. When I say Rome, what do you see? What do you imagine? What do you what do you think of? And we got a few of the things that the Llama was saying, so sort of like stuffy or like, you know, inaccessible, things like that. But one word that like really like sticks to my mind to this day was something along the lines of like, it wasn't obsolete, but it was like primitive or something along those lines. Like basically like othering the culture in a way that made it clear that the student thought like, oh, they weren't advanced in thinking, or they weren't advanced in literature or society or culture, religion, things like that. So when this word got put up on the board, I didn't call anybody out because I wasn't sure who came up with the word in the first place, but like I put on a big show about it. I'm like, primitive? What do you mean primitive? Take a look at all these things that the Romans and just went on a big thing about it. And I try to model like my excitement about classics and the literature that we read and the artifacts that we study to show that it's actually pretty cool. And I tried to do that without bang my students over the head with it, but just trying to illustrate through the things like you've been doing in this podcast, talking about passages, thinking through these relationships, and realizing that, hey, there's more to this than just stuffy words on a piece of paper. You know what I mean?
Hilariously enough, when you say like, what do you think of when you think of Rome, the first thing that comes to mind for me will bring us back to something that we ruined for you, which is Monty Python.
Oh yeah.
What have the Romans ever done?
What have the Romans ever done for us?
Well,
exactly.
they gave us the aqueducts.
Oh, this is a good.
And like all these other things that they start listing off, and also the like Romani ite domum scene with John Cleese correcting him on his Latin grammar.
So good.
Which that's what I think of, which is kind of hilarious because I think it kind of in some ways like makes your point for you to a large degree. Like if you think of all the things that the Romans did, it's actually quite impressive.
For sure.
But people have this imagery of this like ancient civilization,
right,
that it was so, you know, mysterious and less like civilized,
advanced
almost,
and
ours.
Primitive.
Right.
Exactly. And it's interesting that we have that image of it. And I think, you know, in the same way that you may have done that for some of your students, I think for me, like this experience kind of opened up my mind to like the whole Greek mythology thing really is exactly what you're saying it is. It's stories, it's emotions, it's, you know, conflict in a very, very human way.
For sure. For sure.
And I guess going off of that, like I've read a fair bit. I like reading. It's a lot of fun, but I think this is one of the first times I've really like dug deep, like this deep anyway, however deep that may be, into like a work of literature or art or what have you. And like there's a constant question, right? This is true for this I imagine is true for classics, but it's also true for like fiction and art in general, which is like, what good is this really, right? Like, how can we map like the benefits of these basically false things onto reality? Like, this stuff didn't happen. How can what can we point to that we can take away from this? And the answer to that question became, like, I think really, really clear for me as we were talking about this, because you can't properly engage with something like the Iliad or the Odyssey without a lot of emotional honesty. If you want to really do that, you have to leave a lot of yourself on the table, like how you understand certain characters, how you're willing to like question your own reads of those characters, and how you like work through like what the situation is telling you, and that, I think, in a real tangible way has, I would hope, like, increased maybe my emotional intelligence just a little bit. It's gotten me to think a little bit more about, especially in the Odyssey, we talked about how like Penelope or Odysseus are like black boxes, and we have to sort of figure out, but that's kind of true for everyone, right? Like, everyone is kind of a black box, and all we have are the things that they show us, and we have to piece together what's in there, and sort of like take it from academic to make it, it's like academic reading or academic work, to make it very personal, like making a reading of the Iliad very personal or the Odyssey very personal. I think that's something that, like, if I would encourage anyone to like take away, it's like, don't be afraid to make those readings personal.
Yeah, and I think that this sort of goes back to the idea of like treating the Iliad and the Odyssey as like academic exercises as opposed to like stories with real elements to it, right? So I mean, when talking about fiction versus reality and how we can map fiction onto reality, what good does it do to read works like this? I mean, why do people watch Star Wars? Why do they watch modern movies and things like that are clearly based in fantasy, but they display relationships, they display conflict, they display things that tell us about ourselves in terms of the way that we evaluate situations, the way that we see ourselves in the world. Do we see ourselves in Luke Skywalker? Or do we see ourselves in Darth Vader? Right? Like, I think those kinds of questions are as applicable to works like the Iliad and the Odyssey as they are to Star Wars and modern movies. It's just a matter of media in a slightly different form. But all media, all fiction, all good fiction, let me rephrase, is ideally grounded in some sort of reality, right? Even if we're talking about spaceships, or even if we're talking about a war that never happened, there's something real enough about it that keeps people coming back to it over and over again. We've been studying the Iliad and the Odyssey for the past, 2,800 years, right? So there has to be something, there has to be some kernel within it that keeps humans coming back to it. And I fully believe that it's about the elements of reality that we see in it, the way that we fight with our loved ones, the way that we make up, or the way that we can't say sorry because we're too proud, right?
It's the humanity within it.
Yeah, exactly. 100%.
You know, and I think that's part of like what opened it up so much to me this time around reading it, because I've lived so much more life than I had before. You know, when last time I tried to read these works, I was like a teenager, and you just don't have the same breadth of experience as you do when you're older. And having lived all of that life now, I'm just like, all of these things relate to every human that I've ever known, and the flaws within us, and the heights within us, and all of these very, very human elements of just basic existence, you know?
Yeah. And that isn't to say that there isn't anything in the Iliad and the Odyssey for those who are younger, who might not have as much life experience, but I think it's just a matter of like the life experiences that you have up until that point, and what lens you bring to bear on the text, what questions you're asking of it, which is why,
honestly, I think it may be one of its greatest strengths, is it's almost a story that you can grow with.
For sure.
So like when you're a kid, you think of it as, you know, like a fun story about fighting, and there's battles, and this one dude kills the other dude, and you get to cheer for them, and it's like almost going to medieval times or something.
Yeah.
You cheer for your knight, and then the story ends and you're happy.
Yeah, for sure.
When you're a teenager, you start seeing some of the more nuanced things about it, but you're still not quite ready for that. And then as an adult, you read it and you're just like,
holy crap,
there's so much more going on here.
For sure.
There's like layers of complication and just multifaceted elements to like everything that's going on in the Iliad and the Odyssey. You can pick apart almost every single moment in either one of those epic poems and think about it so much more, and that I think just comes with greater life experience and greater knowledge about like who we are as humans and people.
For sure.
I just finished watching No Time to Die, the latest Bond movie. This is the last James Bond movie that Daniel Craig will do, and so we'll get a new iteration. And as I was sort of thinking about, what is the new Bond going to look like, I couldn't help but think of when I don't know if you remember this discussion, Dr. Daniel or Lama, but when I mentioned like what does ugly Achilles look like?
I
right?
love that idea.
Yep.
And like reshaping iconic characters. Iconic meaning like, they're static, they don't change. Or like they're fixed sorts of characters where we have like a clear image of them. And when we see that, like James Bond is one of those characters, I think like either Achilles or like a Greek hero like Achilles sort of fits that mold as well.
I also
But, like,
can't get out of my head the idea of Odysseus, like, and this has transformed in my mind as we've gone on, but like Odysseus being wider than he is tall is an idea that I just love.
Yep.
Sorry,
his
continue.
width is definitely no. I mean that was it's just, I mean, throughout the podcast, I think I've like made references to like movies that I've watched and sort of brought back in my thoughts from the podcast into those things, vice versa. And this is just like, I guess, my last go at it.
Yeah.
It's like, if I were to see a new Achilles, I would want to see like every iteration should be critical, I think, of previous iterations to keep it, if anything, to keep it interesting.
Sorry, I just thought
okay?
ugly Achilles, and then I was like, what if we had the like she's all that version of Achilles, where it goes from ugly Achilles to like really good looking Achilles, and then
Oh,
he
God.
goes to the prom or whatever it is.
That would be an epic poem in and of itself, truly.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm
dear.
so sorry. I'm so sorry, everyone who just heard that.
I can't get that image out of my mind now. But yeah, like
Then I've done my job.
I wonder when the next iteration of Achilles or the Iliad is going to pop out.
Well, it was really fascinating because, I mean, this was actually a discussion very, very recently. So the BBC had a TV show very recently, I think within the last few years, called Troy, Fall of the City. That basically is...
I actually did finish.
Yeah,
watching that.
and the Achilles character is played by a black actor, right? David Gyasi, right? So this created a lot of like a firestorm of controversy amongst BBC viewers because they're like, how can Achilles be portrayed as black in here? Like, that's not in the Iliad, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, there's nothing explicitly in the Iliad that prevents us from seeing that image, right? So, I mean, it's really interesting how different generations or different people that interact with the story of Achilles and the story of Odysseus see these characters, either in terms of reflecting them in a faithful way on screen or trying to not be subversive, but like to tell a new story using these base characters. And I think that's... it's really interesting that you bring that up because this has been a really big conversation in recent years.
Yeah, it gets you in the room. I can't remember. It was Joel Christensen who said it was something like you can get lost in the Iliad by debating like how many oars there were on the ships. Like those details, like once you talk about. Or once you get into these stories, I feel like those details, unless like that's like specifically your field of study, those details sort of tend to fade away and become sort of a non-issue, right?
For sure.
Like I don't care if like a character is blonde or dark-haired, or what the color of their skin is. I care more about like the quality, like
what are they doing?
how they portray what the
But also
what are they doing?
consider
How are they
like
interfacing?
I mean, I think those things are in some ways kind of really interesting to consider, just in the sense of like we've talked over and over about how this was an oral tradition more than anything. So like this is the written version that we have. How many versions did they go through? Like how many oars are on the boat is an interesting question because like how many oars were on the boat in version 1,
right,
in version 2, and version 5, and then finally in the written version. Like how many bards told this story and had 6 oars, 10 oars, 50 oars, like, it could have changed a million times.
For sure.
We'll never know because this is the only version that we have.
This line of thinking has gotten me to spiral just a little bit. To I think speak against inadvertently to speak against the idea that this is like, and I do believe that like the Iliad and the Odyssey are like very accessible works, but like to speak against that, in a way, I haven't read the Iliad, right? I've read someone's version of it, right? Like I've read Robert Fagel's version of the Iliad, and it's close. I imagine it's close, but you know, takes liberties. There are just things that are thrown in and ways of understanding it that, you know, massage the emotional content. Same with Dr. Emily Wilson's. You know, we've talked about we've talked I think a fair bit about like the word choices and how those sort of color how we engage with the Odyssey, as opposed to something like Robert Fagel's, which while the same story, the Odyssey rather, while the same story is also they're kind of two different stories, right? The things you'll get out of them will be way, way different. And so, as I said, in a weird way, I haven't read the Iliad or the Odyssey. Not really. I mean, I can say that I have engaged, but I feel more compelled to say, well, I've read Robert Fagel's translation of the Iliad. I don't feel comfortable saying, oh yeah, I've read the Iliad. That seems weird to say now.
I mean, I'd push back against that a little bit. I mean, you have a sense from reading Fagel's translation of the Iliad and Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. You have a sense of the story. You have a sense of the people. You have a sense of the narrative thrust of the story, like what the way that the events turn out, the way that this person dies in this way, this person like lives in this way, right? And I think that the level of divide between the translation and the ancient Greek, the original language in which this was written down, I think the extent to which that I might have focused on that in some of my tags and whatnot might be a little bit misleading, because you have read the Iliad, you have read the Odyssey. Not only have the two of you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have analyzed it. You have understood parts about it that I didn't even think about before, and I've been studying classics since I was like in high school, right? So I mean, I would give you I would give yourself more credit than that. I think that you have read the Iliad. I think you have read the Odyssey. The thing that knowing ancient Greek or knowing the language behind it can help out with is to help nuance some of the conversations, right? Wherein if we have a debate about like why is Athena portrayed as pigtailed versus Demeter, who's being portrayed as cornrowed in the Odyssey, right? That's just a matter of semantics. But I think you still have the core ideas, and you've analyzed them and talked about them in very profound ways. So hats off. Like I would give yourself much more credit than that.
That feels like high praise, so I'll accept it.
I am not as good at accepting praise. It's like, no
accept
way.
Accept it, darn
but
it.
at the same time, I don't know. I kind of agree
praise.
with you when you say that, though, because like I think unlike Riss, like I really feel like I've read the shit out of the Iliad and the Odyssey as far as most people go, and I will say, one of the things that has struck me most about this process that I really loved was that you did choose, because like I didn't choose the versions of these translations that we read. Rist, you chose these, and I really was surprised in a really pleasant way when you chose Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. I really, really liked that. I mean, I think when we were talking before about kind of the like emotional intelligence factor in this, I was thinking to myself like how interesting it was reading this as a woman, and as a woman in my time, you know, and thinking about all of the radically different things about my situation in terms of the juxtaposition of that with, you know, these really ancient texts, and then reading a translation of the Odyssey written by a woman, which is one of the only ones, if not the only one that I can think of that has been like a major publication.
At least in English, I think, yeah.
At least in English, you know, that to me was like a really interesting experience that I really liked, but it struck me in a certain way of like, I really do feel like I've read this now, and especially with the Odyssey, especially with someone who is like me. You know, in a very like simplistic way, but like I think that's actually more important than people give it credit.
For sure. I mean, seeing yourself reflected in the choices that Emily Wilson made in the translation, the way that she is getting the kudos that she very rightly deserves for this translation.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of that works in terms of drawing folks into the study of classics, right? I think you would have had a very different experience talking about the Odyssey if it were the Fitzgerald translation or if it were the Fagles translation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that it has made it, I think, a little more compelling to me. Like, that's part of what I say when, you know, like what I'm talking about when I say that like classics can feel really inaccessible to certain people. Like if you're not an old white dude, it can at times, and this is a thing in like history too, which is what I study. Like it's a white man's game.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be really isolating for people who aren't that. It can be really alienating to someone who doesn't fit into that mold, that it feels like
you're always
you
engaging
have
with it
to
on
be
someone else's terms.
Right, exactly.
engaging on those terms. Exactly.
Yeah. And
you know, so I think this renewed the experience for me in a really pleasantly refreshing way.
yeah, I think that the image that you brought up at the beginning of our discussion of classics is sort of like a dusty, sort of like up on the shelf kind of discipline, and exactly what he said just now, sort of like an old white dude's kind of domain, is not untrue. Of course not. But there's been, I know that I personally have been trying to like break down the stereotype a lot.
Yeah.
And I mean, listeners at home can't see me right now, but just to let you know what I look like, I am a Filipino American. I am 33 years old. I wear glasses. Also, I wear this watch that has a rainbow wristband. You can guess what that means, right? On my very first semester of teaching at the college that I'm at right now, I taught an earlier version of that Roman Lit course, and I walked into the classroom, and students didn't know that I was the professor. They didn't realize that the classics teacher was going to be this young like Filipino dude who's gay, like standing in front of the classroom. I am very young. Thank you. I appreciate that. But a student actually, a Filipino student in the class, actually came to my office hours to explicitly tell me, you did not look what I thought you were going to look like when I signed up for Classics 102, because typically classics is about the study of Greece and Rome. What interest would a Filipino guy have in the literature of Greece or the literature of Rome or the languages, right? And I think that just showing that anyone can read the Iliad, anyone can read the Odyssey, anyone can appreciate the stories and the relationships and the conflicts that these stories tell, and you don't have to have Greek heritage or Italian heritage to appreciate that. These are universal ideas, and it's something that I fell in love with when I was in high school. I was forced to take Latin in high school. That's actually how I got started in classics. But the languages and the literature just like entranced me. These stories have stuck with me since I was 14 years old. So trying to impart that kind of excitement over these stories and trying to show that it's not just an old white dude's domain, I think it's really been one of the primary drivers in my career to try to make it more accessible to folks that look like me or that identify like me.
It's also a very, very rapidly growing conversation in the history field as well, because it's a very similar kind of thing. It has been a field that is dominated by white men, that is dominated by people who fit into a very patriarchal mold.
Yeah.
But it is increasingly breaking out of that, and I think all for the better.
Yeah.
Like, I think the more people who have access, not only access, but like feel a sense of inclusivity when it comes to not necessarily even studying the classics, but just consuming them.
Yep.
I think the better the field can become, because the more perspectives you get, the more you can increase, you know, the knowledge and the thought around that subject. So I think it's just a win-win situation, which is honestly part of why I agreed to do this podcast.
This is exactly the point I was about to bring up, because when it comes to classics, like we think about like, okay, let's read this scholarly article or like check out this book from the library or something like that. Podcasts, what a great idea to make this story accessible to a larger audience. You talking about it, the two of you, and analyzing it and coming at it from your individual experiences, I think it's going to do way more good than a chapter in this Festschrift or this edited article in JSTOR is ever going to do for the field, right? So,
and I have to say, like, I'm so glad that you agreed to come on, because obviously we have the luxury of having you here, as opposed to, like, most readers probably don't. But having sort of like someone to like bounce what we say off of and like fill in those gaps has been like invaluable. Like I've loved listening to all your tags.
In short, for me at least, it's been nice to know that I'm not completely talking out of my ass all the time.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Like I also carry that that insecurity. I will ask you, Dr. Daniel, since you have brought it up, I am curious. What can you point out one thing that we talked about that you hadn't, I guess, considered or thought about or whatever? I can't remember what the words that you said. Because I'm interested just what that looks like.
So my bread and butter as a
if you can.
Yeah, I mean, it actually involves an example that I think I just brought up. So as a classicist, my bread and butter is in the field of philology, which literally means like loving words. So like I like to take narratives apart word by word and figure out what's the meaning of using this word versus that word or things like that. You had a question in an episode of the Odyssey. I think I can't remember if it was Lama or Rist, but a question about, or you commented about how Athena is depicted as pigtailed, and how it seems to sort of like jolt you out of not complacency, but give you a different image than you thought you would be getting from a classic work like this, right? Because when we think of pigtails on a young girl, it's often more of a modern type of image, right? So then there was a question about that, and there was a question about Demeter being portrayed as having cornrows in her hair in book 5, and the same thing happens in book 7. So after that got mentioned in the podcast, like I went back to the ancient Greek because I hadn't actually read those sections in a very long time. Like the last time I read the Odyssey in Greek was like back in grad school, so many years ago. And looking at it, I realized, and I talk about this in the tag, that the same adjective gets used for both cornrowed and pigtailed, euplokamos. And that just really got me thinking about, like, what is Emily Wilson doing by taking this one word and translating it in two different ways? This has to be deliberate because she's a good classicist. She knows that euplokamos in both contexts is going to mean something very specific. So then it got me asking the question, why? And then that got me thinking even further about it. So making those observations, those things that even I don't notice on glancing at the text, I think there are lots of those moments that brought me to the ancient Greek and made me think about the words and the way that the story gets composed in a much deeper way that I haven't had the luxury to think about before. Because honestly, the last time I read the Odyssey, like I was cramming for my qualifiers in grad school. I was like ingesting like book after book of the Odyssey, and nothing was sticking in my mind. So the opportunity to like use your thoughts and use your discussion as a springboard to get back into the text and pick it apart really helped me like get back to my roots and really appreciate what's there in Homer.
I'm honored.
And if you'll allow me to kick a compliment back to you, Dr. Daniel, I like your, and again, there's no way of, I don't know the best way of saying this. You could have phoned in these tags, right? Like enough. You could have given us something, but it always seems like, again, like the tag you're referencing in particular, the one for book, I think it's 16 or 15 or something like that, or episode 15 or 16.
Yeah.
Like I was, one of the things that struck me about all your tags is that like you're doing like research and work and stuff like that and looking things up and that's like, it's awesome that you're doing it. You didn't have to do that, but you're going above and beyond.
The amount of time and effort you've put into this is truly astounding, and I think we both really deeply appreciate it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was deeply honored to be asked, and honestly, any opportunity that I get to nerd out about Homer, about the ancient Greek, about language, about things like that.
And this is why this podcast exists. Like literally why this podcast exists.
Huge nerd.
Is a huge nerd project, which is honestly a great part of why I agreed to it, because it's just, I love it. I absolutely love it when people just go hardcore nerd in on a topic that maybe they haven't explored before, but like you know that they're such a nerd that it's gonna be intense. I mean,
Yeah.
this is very redundant, but intensely nerdy.
Yeah.
Which we both are, you know, and everyone that I think we've had on probably is.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I love that so much. It's so much fun to just be a total nerd.
For sure.
One common thing with like the projects that I tend to take on is that it's more work than I expected.
Yep.
When you agreed to do this, Dr. Daniel, and I guess this question goes to you as well, Llama. Like, was it more than you like? Obviously,
Yes.
before you went in, you had like certain expectations, and like, oh, I'll do this. I know talking to you, Grad. I keep going back and forth between calling you Grad.
And that's
Dr.
fine.
Daniel.
That's fine. Yeah.
Like I know for you, I was like, I framed it as, you'll come in for like 10, 15 minutes, then you'll talk. Obviously you'll listen to what we said, but like, did the image of what that would entail at that time, does that match up with what you ended up doing?
No, I ended up doing way more than I thought. But honestly, the reason why, I mean, first of all, I'm a tryhard to begin with. But also, I mean, again, I wouldn't have spent the time that I did, and I wouldn't have done the research that I did if your discussions hadn't led me to it. Again, the ideas that you brought up, the debates that you've had, the little words that you picked out, and the passages that you decided to focus on, like, they got my gears turning. They really got me thinking about what's happening in Homer and made me want to go to my text and look up the Greek and translate it. It made me want to like reread this translation that I've looked at like now like 5 or 6 times in my start to finish over and over again. Again, that's a credit to the two of you, because if you didn't give me the material to hang my hat on, I wouldn't have done the research that I did, because your questions were just so insightful and they were so and they really got my philological and analytical gears turning. So thank you for that.
So
Yeah.
this is an interesting question for me, because you and I both know that when you asked me to do this, I was like, I'm really interested in this and it sounds very cool, but I need to think about it.
Yeah.
So like, give me a night or maybe 2. And then I ended up getting back to you the next day, I think, saying yes,
That's pretty quick.
obviously, because we're here. But I had a feeling that this would take over way more of my life than I thought it would, because I don't know any other way to do things.
Right.
Like, which is to say, like, I got my BA in history. It's a really, really intense subject
Rigorous.
to get involved in. I've never lost that, even though it's been a decent chunk of time since I got that BA, but I'm now taking, a grad school class and I'm trying to get back into that world. So like the nerd has never left me. That like big ass nerd. But I was just like, I know though that like podcasting takes research, it takes time, it takes thought, and then that's not even factoring in the amount of time that we were recording and stuff like that. So, like, I had to genuinely think about it and be like, do I have the time in my life to devote to this? Not only just, like, do I have the time to record this, but also, like, mentally devote myself to this? Because, again, I don't know, like, only way I know how, man. Only way I know how. Like, I can't do a project like this that is a big fucking nerd project and not be a big fucking nerd about it.
Sure.
I don't know the alternative to that. So, like, I knew it would be me reading these 2 books over and over for, like, 3.5 months. Plus whatever,
so you had perhaps a clearer vision of what it would look like.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also, I don't know. I listen to a lot of podcasts and I just hear from them, like, the amount of time that goes into it. And it's a lot. But again, I'm really glad I did it, because it has been so much fun. It got me thinking about these works in very different ways. I've gotten to spend all this time with Dr. Daniel talking about all these things. I've gotten to spend all this time with you. Both of us, I think, having influence over the other in terms not necessarily of changing each other's minds about stuff, but just opening each other's minds to perhaps different ways of seeing different things in literature. I think it has probably changed the way that I read classics from here on out. I'm interested in going into more of them, not on a podcast, because I don't think ever again will I, devote this much time of my life to putting these things down on recording.
Now that you know what the Kool-Aid tastes like,
Exactly.
You're not going back for seconds.
I liked the flavor. 1 cup was enough.
Yeah.
However, am I absolutely going to be asking Dr. Daniel when he has a free moment what I perhaps should be reading next? Yeah, I'm absolutely fucking doing that.
You should read the Aeneid, but anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, well, that was.
I am taking notations.
Sorry.
Honestly, that was kind of like the question I wanted to. I'm not gonna absolutely close the doors after this question. But for Dr. Daniel, we've done this. We've read the major myths. We haven't gotten to the Aeneid. Obviously that's on the list. Yet. But I also feel like I might need a nice little long break from doing this, as lovely as it was. But I guess aside from primary sources, could you or do you have any suggestions for listeners as to where they might find, I don't know, new or what have you, ways of exploring these myths? What research should they? What is
the continuation of the entry point?
Yeah.
How does an interested party pursue this further?
That's a really interesting question because,
by your estimation,
it's a really interesting question because I think it largely depends on what you enjoyed about the Iliad and the Odyssey, and what you're taking away from it, and why you enjoyed it in the first place, right? So, for example, if you like the drama of the situation, you like the staging of the battles, and you like the drama of Odysseus' reveal and things like that, maybe I'll point you towards works of tragedy or comedy. If you really enjoyed the sort of the storytelling nature of it, the bardic sort of sense of it, maybe I'll point you towards the Aeneid. If you enjoyed the myth part of it, maybe I'll point you towards Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is a work in Latin, the Roman side of things, but talks about a lot of Greek myths and transformations and things like that. So I think, again, it really depends on what you personally enjoyed about the Iliad and the Odyssey. The sort of milquetoast answer that I can give as a classicist is that the Iliad and the Odyssey belong to the genre of epic poetry, primarily on the Greek side. The natural pair of epic works to those on the Greek side are Virgil's Aeneid and Ovid's Metamorphoses on the Latin side, the Roman side. They talk about very, very different things, and they're very, very different stories, very, very clearly. But I think that in terms of expanding beyond what you've seen in the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you're interested in that type of storytelling mode, those would be the next two things that I'd suggest looking at.
Nice. Can I also say that you now have a new final project idea for your students to create a 20-minute podcast with a partner?
Fun fact, that was already one of my assignments in my
really?
classes.
Oh,
so
that's
awesome.
So in a lot of my classes, particularly the classes that I teach in translation, so students that don't have Greek or Latin but want to read these things in translation, what I like to do in these classes is to get students engaging with the material in a more creative fashion than just writing an essay or taking an objective quiz or something like that. So in my classes, I have a weird grading structure wherein if you fulfill a certain number of requirements, then you get a certain grade for the semester. And in some of my classes, you can do up to 4 creative projects. They include things like create a podcast that teaches about one of the things that we learned about in class, create a video that illustrates an episode that we talked about in this narrative, create a Spotify playlist of 5 to 10 songs that embodies this idea that we were talking about, create a TikTok about the drinking culture in in
I
Greece
feel so
or something like
old
that.
now.
I try to like update. I also have like create memes based on the stories.
That is amazing.
Live tweet a reading or something like that. So like basically like trying to come.
Live tweet a reading.
I'm just thinking
It's pretty
about
funny.
how when I was an undergrad, how all of that would have been absolutely unimaginable. But that is seriously cool.
But that's the idea too, right? So I mean, if we're trying to talk about how these things relate to the modern day, then it stands to reason that we should use modern day things to try to relate to the material, right? So if we're talking about memes, we're talking about podcasts, we're talking about videos. These are all things that you can use on your phone or whatever to like connect with the material and think about it in a different way than an essay or an exam or something like that. So beat you to the punch there, Wrist.
Damn it.
Amazing.
But do you have any that are group projects? Do you have any group project podcasts?
So students can do groups if they wanted to. One of my favorite assignments from recent times was actually a TikTok about symposium or drinking culture in ancient Greece, where students like had like
That's awesome.
a series of like 4 TikToks where they like basically acted out what it would be like to walk into an ancient Greek symposium, and like how they would drink the wine, how they would like lounge on a couch and things like that. Things like that. I just love. I eat that
That's
stuff
pretty
up.
awesome.
So yes, podcasts A+.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Amazing.
Well, I think we have come up to about our time. I mean, I could continue talking about this, I suppose, but Dr. Daniel is weary from his trials and tribulations as a human being.
Out on the ocean, buffeted by
a professor.
Poseidon. Yep.
Indeed.
But I poured
there-
out the wine today.
It didn't work, Llama. I'm sorry. Your libation was ineffective. I'm sorry.
I mean, my libation has been incredibly effective.
You need to burn more thigh bones.
But I will not start burning thigh bones.
Oh gosh.
What are you
Cook them
doing,
to
Love?
I will cook them to the correct temperature as I always have. Burning them. What are you talking about?
Oh.
You can make him into stock. I don't know.
I'm just saying you said burning, and I object to that
Oh yeah,
as
I mean,
someone who
you have to
cooks a
you have to
lot.
send the smoke up to the gods.
And then once the
right?
smoke is
Okay,
gone, then you
that's
can like make a nice
Sure.
stock, a nice smoky stock or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right, fine. I'll figure
But
out a way to
it's-
smoke the bones.
Yeah. Is
That one was for you.
Oh, that
one
was so
for
good.
you, Russ.
That was so good.
is there are there any final words that y'all would like to leave us with in these last few minutes that we have?
I just want to say thank you for having me on. I've had a blast contributing the tags. I hope that you both, it sounds like you got something out of them. I hope the listeners got something out of them. And again, any chance I get to talk about Homer or classics, I'm there for it. So thank you again for having me on.
The next step is to get listeners. That's the hard part.
Therein lies the rub, yeah.
I similarly would like to say thank you for inviting me to do this as your co-host. It's been a real fucking pleasure. I've had a really good time doing this, and I'm really, really glad I said yes to it, because I know that there was a point where it was just like, as I said, you know, do I have the mental time and the physical time to devote to this? And it was a real question, and I'm glad I said yes, because it's been a really, really fun experience, and I've learned a lot. I've gotten to spend time in the company of some really cool people, namely all of our guests, you, Wrists, you, Dr. Daniel. Like, thank you both so much. And yeah, thank you, Wrist, and to everyone who is listening out there, thank you for joining us on this journey. It's been a hell of a lot of fun, and I think this is Llama signing off.
Yeah, and I'll just say to close out to like thank you guys for this is sort of a weird project because there's a world where it's just not very good, right? There's a world where there's not a lot to as you've said, grad hang your hat on, or Llama. This could have just been like a miserable commitment, and like there's I am a black
say
box.
That, but I definitely thought it.
Yeah, I mean, like I am a black box to both of you, and so you had to trust
Yep.
You had to trust
We've
that
come
I
full
had
circle.
that I had good intentions and good ability, whatever that looks like. And so yeah, thank you all for trusting me that far and for giving as hopefully as good as you got. I don't know. And of course, thanks to if there are indeed listeners who have made it through this whole trek. I hope y'all have enjoyed it. I hope you've taken the opportunity to read along, or at least like look up some Spark Notes so that you can understand along. I encourage y'all to I don't know, like start projects of your own that are like this. If you love this, then like express it. It's the worst that can happen is no one looks at it, and in that case, you're in the clear. You know? But the best that can happen of it is that you have an experience that you've that you wouldn't have otherwise had, and I definitely wouldn't have experienced these works to this degree if I didn't have these kind folks with me reading them and talking with me about them every step of the way. So thank y'all. Thank you for listening. Again, we hope that you've read along. We hope you've enjoyed. I can't say we'll be back for a season 2, but, you know, that's just the way it goes. So I guess this is it. Dr. Daniel, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for
one
having
last
me.
time.
Thanks for having me.
And Llama, thank you for tolerating me throughout this whole thing.
It has been my distinct pleasure and honor.
And to the readers, listeners, both. Thank y'all.
Hopefully both.
And yeah, Homeward Bound out.